$17,584 is the precise amount of American tax money incinerated every single hour this specific machine remains airborne. Memorize that financial figure, because it represents the exact burn rate required to keep the United States Navy's premier strike fighter operating above the flight deck. The Boeing A-18E Super Hornet stands as a masterpiece of applied violence, engineered to scream at Mach 1.8 while crushing its pilot with 7.5 Gs. It serves as the reigning heavyweight champion of the modern carrier air wing, designed to track 6 aerial targets simultaneously while delivering precision ordnance. However, if you analyze the classified flight operations report for the USS Ronald Reagan right now, you will discover a statistic that defies all economic logic. 30% of every single Super Hornet sortie flown across the fleet today is not a combat mission against a hostile foreign power. These supersonic fighters are not hunting enemy MiGs in the stratosphere, and they are certainly not dropping JDAMs on hardened bunkers deep inside enemy territory. Instead, they are flying in slow, lazy circles at 20,000 feet, trailing a rubber hose from their belly like a glorified piece of utility equipment. We are taking a $70 million supersonic strike fighter and forcing it to operate as a subsonic flying gas station for hours on end. Strategically, this is the equivalent of purchasing a Ferrari Formula One race car, ripping out the passenger seat, and using it to deliver cheap pizza. To the forensic accountants in Washington, this operational pattern looks like insanity, an economic crime that burns through the fleet's maintenance budget for breakfast. But here on Navy Decoded, we do not analyze the situation through budget sheets. We look directly at the engineering blueprints of the machine. When you examine the blueprints, you realize that this massive waste of resources is not an accident, but a desperate and calculated survival mechanism. We are deliberately burning the fatigue life of our premier fighter fleet because the geography of the modern battlefield leaves us with no other choice. We are currently fighting a war against an enemy that does not care about our quarterly financial reports or the lifespan of our airframes. The enemy is not a specific nation. It is not a flag, and it is not a political ideology that we can negotiate with. The enemy is geometry itself, and today we are going to tear apart the flight deck operations manual to expose the invisible walls trapping the Navy. We will explain why the most powerful military on Earth is spending nearly $8 billion on a band-aid to fix a 30-year-old mistake. Welcome to the calculus of sacrifice, where we destroy our own machinery in peace to ensure it might survive the first day of war. To understand why we are destroying our fighters in the air, you first have to understand the catastrophic history of the neck-down strategy. Travel back to the 1980s, and you would see the flight deck of the USS Nimitz looking like a chaotic zoo of specialized engineering marvels. We operated the A-6 Intruder, a dedicated long-range heavy bomber that could carry a massive nuclear payload deep into the heart of enemy territory. We deployed the KA-6D, a dedicated tanker variant that existed solely to feed the thirsty fleet and extend the range of our strike aircraft. We utilized the S-3 Viking, affectionately called the Hoover, a submarine hunter that doubled as an incredibly efficient high-altitude gas truck for the air wing. These aircraft were highly specialized, they were aesthetically ugly, and they were purpose-built for the unglamorous grind of naval logistics and fuel delivery. Then the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Pentagon succumbed to a dangerous arrogance regarding the future of naval aviation warfare. We looked at the peace dividend and decided to radically simplify the air wing to save massive amounts of money on spare parts and pilot training. We retired the Intruder, we retired the Viking, and we threw away the specialized tools that gave the carrier strike group its incredible strategic reach. We bet the entire farm on a single airframe, the F-18, believing one jet could do everything from dogfighting to tanking without breaking a sweat. It was a doctrine of extreme efficiency that worked perfectly as long as we were bombing insurgents who possessed no Navy and no Air Force. But while we were celebrating our savings, our adversaries were studying our math and building weapons, specifically designed to exploit our new logistical weakness. Now, the Super Hornet is forced to shoulder the burden of the entire air wing, acting as a mission tanker to extend the fleet's range. This creates a phenomenon known as the tanking tax, a hidden cost that is measured not in dollars, but in critical metal fatigue. Every time a Hornet launches with a 5 wet configuration, 4 underwing tanks, and 1 centerline store, it is operating at its absolute maximum gross weight. The physics of launching a 30-ton aircraft off a steam catapult places catastrophic stress on the airframe that accumulates with every single cycle. The titanium keel beam, the spine of the aircraft, is twisted and compressed with violence. It was never designed to endure on a repeated basis. Naval engineers track this structural damage using a specific metric called Fatigue Life Expended, which pilots and maintainers refer to simply as FLE. Flying straight and level in a clean configuration burns FLE at a rate of 1, which is the baseline for normal operational wear and tear. Slamming a heavy tanker onto the deck during a recovery burns FLE at a rate of 10 or higher, accelerating the aging process exponentially. We are aging our aircraft 10 times faster than the designers intended, grinding our sword into dust just to keep it sharp for the next mission. And the friction doesn't stop in the air. It starts the moment the wheels touch the unforgiving steel of the carrier flight deck. The flight deck of a Nimitz-class carrier is 4.5 acres of sovereign American territory, but to the handler, it is a high-stakes prison. Space here is the ultimate currency, calculated in blood, efficiency, and inches, where a single mistake can halt the entire launch cycle immediately. If you misplace a tractor, you stop a launch. If you park a jet 3 inches over the foul line, you shut down the runway. It is a high-stakes game of Tetris played with 30-ton explosives and jet fuel, where the margin for error is effectively zero. In this game, there is one piece that ruins everything: the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye, a massive radar plane that dominates the limited deck space. Pilots call it the Hummer because of the sound of its twin turboprops, but deck crews call it the deck clogger for good reason. Its 80-foot wingspan dominates the bow, creating a geometric bottleneck that effectively paralyzes the flow of the entire carrier air wing during operations. When the handler spots a single Hawkeye on the catapults, he effectively loses the real estate required for staging 2 fully loaded strike fighters. It is a massive aluminum brick that dominates the catapult track, but the size is only half of the logistical problem it creates. Unlike the F-18 or F-35, the E-2D lacks an onboard auxiliary power unit capable of starting its own massive engines independently. To wake this beast, the deck crew must drag over a mobile electric power plant called a huffer to physically crank the starters. This creates a phenomenon called tethering, where the aircraft is physically leashed to heavy support gear, effectively anchoring it to one spot on the deck. Once the engines start, the 8-bladed NP-2000 propellers slice through the air, creating a lethal exclusion zone that severs deck arteries. You cannot drive a tractor or tow a fighter jet past that prop arc without risking immediate catastrophe and death. This is why the first plane to shoot off the catapult during a cycle is almost always the E-2 Hawkeye. Civilians think this is purely tactical, to get the radar up early, but 90% of the decision is pure logistics. The handler kicks the Hawkeye off the ship because he needs that 80-foot wall gone so the real war can begin. But once the deck is clear, the problem shifts from the steel of the carrier to the geometry of the Pacific. While we focused on efficiency, the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force focused on range, specifically with the DF-26 ballistic missile. Intelligence analysts call it the Guam Killer, an intermediate-range weapon designed to push the U.S. Navy out of the second island chain. It is equipped with a maneuverable re-entry vehicle capable of adjusting its trajectory at hypersonic speeds to hunt a moving aircraft carrier. The most terrifying number associated with this weapon is not its speed, but its operational range of 2,500 miles. That distance creates a kill box that forces the American carrier strike group to remain in a sanctuary far from the coast. If the captain sails inside that 2,500-mile ring, he risks a $13 billion asset against a saturation attack of warheads. Now look at our Spear, the Lockheed Martin F-35C Lightning II, the most advanced stealth fighter ever built by human hands. To remain invisible to enemy radar, the F-35 cannot carry external fuel tanks, as they act as massive radar reflectors. Relying solely on internal fuel, the F-35C has a combat radius of approximately 600 to 670 nautical miles. Do the subtraction, the ship is 2,500 miles away, and the jet can only fly 600 miles. There is a logistical void of 1,900 miles that renders the most expensive warship in history operationally irrelevant. Without a bridge across that gap, the carrier becomes a floating airfield to nowhere, a sword too short to strike the enemy. To solve this, the Navy uses a tactic called mid-course staging to physically throw the stealth fighter into the fight. The carrier sits safely at mile 0, while an F-18 tanker and an F-35C launch together into the gray zone. They fly 500 miles out, staying below the radar horizon where the curvature of the Earth hides the non-stealthy Hornet. At the 500-mile mark, the F-35 connects to the F-18's basket and drinks until its internal tanks are 100% full. The F-18 turns around and goes home, while the F-35, effectively starting a new mission closer to the target, pushes on alone. Tactically, it is a brilliant solution that solves the geometry problem, but physically, it is destroying the Super Hornet fleet. This brings us back to the $17,000 per hour problem and the molecular violence we are inflicting on our own aircraft. To serve as a tanker, the Super Hornet is loaded with 5 massive fuel tanks, pushing it to its absolute maximum takeoff weight. It is like asking an Olympic sprinter to run a 100-meter dash while carrying a commercial refrigerator on their back. In 2 seconds, the steam catapult accelerates this massive block of inertia from 0 to 165 knots. The forces at play are brutal. The heavy fuel wants to stay still, while the shuttle wants to throw it forward. The victim of this war is the aircraft's structure, specifically the wing roots and the titanium carry-through bulkheads. But the destruction does not stop at launch. The aerodynamics of refueling creates a parasite that eats away at the airframe. To refuel the F-35, the Super Hornet extends a hose and a drogue basket that looks small but creates immense resistance. NASA wind tunnel data confirms that the drogue assembly alone generates up to 450 pounds of parasitic drag. It is the aerodynamic equivalent of tying a parachute to your waist and trying to run a marathon at full speed. This creates a constant low-frequency vibration that rattles the airframe down to its rivets for the entire duration of the sortie. However, the real assassin, the one that truly breaks the machine, is not the launch or the drag, but the recovery. In a perfect world, a tanker flies out, gives away all its gas, and comes back light and easy to land. But war is messy. Sometimes the mission is scrubbed, or the strike fighters do not need as much fuel as predicted. The tanker returns to the ship still carrying thousands of pounds of unburnt kerosene, making it heavy and sluggish. Now the pilot has to slam this overweight beast onto a moving steel deck that is pitching in the ocean's swell. An arrested landing is not a graceful touchdown. It is a controlled car crash designed to catch the number 3 wire. The pilot does not flare. He drives the jet directly into the steel to ensure the tailhook engages the cross-deck pendant. When a 5-wet Super Hornet hits the deck, the kinetic energy transfer is catastrophic for the landing gear and airframe. The shockwave travels up the struts and shatters through the skeleton of the jet, causing microfractures in the aluminum. A single heavy trap does 10 times more structural damage to the lifespan of the jet than an hour of normal flight. Eventually, the physics wins. Microcracks propagate through the aluminum bulkheads, and the metal simply gives up. A jet engineered to last 6,000 flight hours starts showing signs of structural death at 4,000. We are burning the candle at both ends, destroying the airframe to bridge a strategic gap we created ourselves. Faced with a dying fleet, the Navy had 3 hard choices: stop tanking, buy new planes, or perform radical surgery. Option A was impossible because without the tankers, the carrier is useless against the Chinese rocket force. Option B was too slow. Production lines cannot churn out new jets fast enough to replace the losses. So they chose option C, the Service Life Modification program, known in the Pentagon simply as SLM. This is the $7.8 billion bill for our strategic complacency. This program is not about building new weapons. It is about industrial resurrection. We take these tired, beaten-down Super Hornets and strip them down to their absolute metallic skeleton. We rip out the internals, inspect every square inch for corrosion, and replace the shattered keel beams. We reinforce the bulkheads and practically rebuild the aircraft from the inside out to reset the clock. The goal is to extend the service life from 6,000 hours to 10,000 hours. The cost is roughly $10 million per aircraft, a staggering price to pay for a mechanical band-aid. We are spending billions to fix the damage we caused by using a supersonic Ferrari to deliver pizza. It is a self-inflicted wound, a logistical penalty for retiring the specialized A-6 and S-3 30 years ago. So, the next time you see footage of a Super Hornet refueling another jet, do not just admire the technology. Look at the hose. That hose is a lifeline, but it is also a parasite sucking the life out of the host. Every gallon of jet fuel transferred is a minute of structural life subtracted from the tanker's airframe. Critics and accountants look at this arrangement and scream about waste and inefficiency. They point to the MQ-25 Stingray drone and ask, why don't we have the unmanned tankers yet? The answer is brutal and grounded in the reality of the current calendar year, 2026. While the MQ-25 has finally begun taxi tests and is nearing its first flight, it is not here yet. Initial operational capability has slipped to 2027, and full fleet integration is years away. You cannot fight a war with prototypes that are still sitting in a hangar in St. Louis. The war does not wait for your research and development schedule or your budget cycles. Right now, today, the American commander in the Pacific has to make a binary choice. He can save his planes and lose the strategic reach, effectively parking the carrier out of the fight, or he can burn his planes, accept the structural damage, and hold the line against the DF-26. He chooses to burn the planes because that is the engineering trade-off of modern warfare. We sacrifice the tactical longevity of the machine to ensure the strategic survival of the fleet. We trade metal for distance, we trade billions of dollars in maintenance for deterrence. Peace is not free. It is paid for in fatigue, cracks, and shattered titanium components. It is paid for by the sweat of the maintainers who keep these overstressed birds in the air. This is the brutal reality of the Pax Americana. It isn't magic, it is a grinder. And the A-18 Super Hornet is the grist for that mill, dying a slow death so the carrier can live. That is not bad management. That is the cold, hard discipline of power. If you have the stomach to look at the real cost of freedom, measured in stressed metal, you understand the trade. We are eating our own young because the alternative is starvation in the middle of the Pacific. But there is one final layer to this calculus that most observers miss completely. It is not just about the planes. It is about the pilots trapped in this loop. A pilot trained to kill, trained to dogfight, is spending hundreds of hours flying in circles. Their skills atrophy as they become glorified gas station attendants in the sky. This creates a morale crisis that is just as dangerous as the structural fatigue. You are taking the tip of the spear and blunting it against the grindstone of logistics. Yet, the system persists because the geometry of the theater demands it. The invisible walls of the Pacific Ocean dictate our tactics more than any admiral ever could. We have built a machine that consumes itself to survive. A paradox of modern military engineering. The only way to break this cycle is to change the variables of the equation entirely. This is why the Navy is pouring resources into the Next Generation Air Dominance Program, or FAXX. They need a platform designed from the keel up to operate inside the anti-access area denial bubble. But until that future arrives, we are stuck in the uncomfortable present, patching up the past. Every dollar spent on rebuilding a shattered Hornet is a dollar spent on buying one more day of deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. It is a transaction that makes absolutely no sense to a civilian auditor, but it makes perfect sense to a naval war planner. We are physically trading the lifespan of American aluminum for the lifespan of the current geopolitical order. The $17,584 per hour cost is not just an operating expense. It is the premium on an insurance policy against total war, paid in installments of jet fuel and titanium. If the Super Hornet fleet collapses before the MQ-25 and FAXX arrive, the carrier becomes a paper tiger. The moment the carrier loses its reach, the entire security architecture of the Western Pacific crumbles into the ocean. So we will continue to launch 5 wet tankers. We will continue to crush the landing gear. And we will continue to pay the bill. We will grind the most versatile fighter jet in history into scrap metal because the mission demands it. This is the unsentimental truth of military logistics. Assets are expendable, victory is not. The pilots know it, the maintainers know it, and now you know the math behind the madness. This is what it actually takes to keep the fleet afloat when the shooting starts. It is not about Top Gun heroics. It is about the cold, hard management of physics and finance. If you are the kind of person who has the stomach to look at the real cost of power, you are in the right place. We don't just look at the hull numbers. We look at the fatigue index and the fuel charts. We expose the invisible friction that defines modern warfare. If you understand the trade-off, if you understand why we burn billions to buy distance, make yourself known in the comments. Type calculus if you see the logic behind the waste. This is Navy Decoded. We don't talk about heroism. We talk about the math. Subscribe for the next briefing.